Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko in Houston, Texas.
And Thomas Zeitzoff in Rockville, Maryland.
Thomas is joining us today to talk about political violence. We've seen an increase in rhetoric around violence in American politics. There have been many incidents of violence related to the American far right in more recent terms, like things like January 6th and the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. But there's also an element of political violence on the left, which we are also going to discuss today. But Thomas is a professor in the School of Public Affairs at American University. His research focuses on political violence and political psychology. And then he is also the author of Nasty Politics and numerous other books, including a forthcoming book on the radical environmental movement, which maybe we'll talk about that just a little bit. But we also have talked about doing a future show on that as well. Thomas, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys. Really great to be here.
And maybe just to kick it off on just American views on political violence, how many Americans actually support political violence? How has the recent past sort of affected American views on this?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. I think a lot of, at least folks in more of the mainstream media, miss this in the sense that I think a lot of the support for political violence is not at the mass level. So if you do surveys, and the surveys that suggest increases in concerns about civil war or other sorts of things are more people's perception about what they feel. So if you ask people and give them a survey question, somebody who is a member of your political party throws a firebomb through the other party's campaign offices, you're going to get maybe 3 or 4% who support that in any which way. So actual support is quite low for political violence. But if you ask people, what do you think the other side supports it more? There's definitely been, I think, increasing concerns about acceptability of violence, but the number of people who actually support it is pretty low.
Before we go on, let's get to this issue of what violence is, because we saw this a lot, especially in 2020 or January 6th. I think 4 or 5 people were killed. So you can see how that's violent. We saw the images. But what about putting a rock through a Target store in Minneapolis or even burning down a police precinct? Do you include that in it? And if so, how does that break down in terms of who's doing it or who's inciting it?
Yeah, property destruction is maybe an interesting thing. And I know there are a ton of debates about this. And I would describe it as threats against outgroup partisans. That's what I see. So if you're throwing a firebomb in order to intimidate the other side, right, at a campaign office, that's a violent act. You're trying to block them from expression or campaigning or other sorts of things. I think there was, and there definitely is, people trying to say that some of property destruction and other things that occurred around the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd is the same as what happened on January 6th. That's a very kind of mainstream right-wing sort of talking point. And those are not even close to the same wheelhouse, because you can say property destruction is bad, but I would say the bigger concern is not it's where it's happening, right? One is happening at a Target store, and one is basically trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power and engage in an insurrection that's part of a broader kind of auto golpe or self-coup. That's the one that, as a political scientist, that one I'm way more concerned about. We can talk more about whether property destruction or other sorts of things are useful for activists in general, but as a political scientist, I'm not worried about a Target store in Minneapolis as much as I am the Capitol set on fire.
Yeah, that's why I asked, because we do see this equivalency now where saying something bad on Twitter becomes the same as January 6th or something like that.
Yeah, and speaking of that, how much is social media actually influential in this whole arena?
This is where I got interested in a lot of political violence, was looking way back. I'm talking about the Arab Spring. And I remember what's interesting about, I think, just the social media is to remind people back. And I know Scott and maybe Bob, you remember, but I think especially Scott, we're talking 2008, 2009, Twitter's first on the scene. You have protests in Iran, the foiled Green Revolution. But I remember Clay Shirky, this kind of prominent, and I hate to use this term, thought leader, but thought leader, published this article, like the revolution will be tweeted. And people saw social media as like this unbridled champion of democracy. And I remember being at like these not very fancy, but like medium fancy, like gigs when I was a grad student. And they were sponsored by folks in the tech industry talking about all the ways that they were helping these nascent democracy movements in the Arab Spring. And I remember they had, though, and this is as the Syrian civil war started to heat up, they had activists from Syria. And I remember everybody was like, look, we just need more social media, more coverage. It's going to be great. I remember this activist basically said, yes, it's been helpful, but I think you guys should be aware is that we thought it was great. And we then, like all my friends and activist friends in Syria, downloaded this encrypted Skype app. And it turned out it wasn't an encrypted Skype app. It turned out it was the Syrian regime, and it was really bad for us. So I think that's just one thing, is that our views on social media have shifted tremendously across time. And I think that's true. I also think people want to blame social media as saying it's like the cause, it's the incitement. And I don't really buy that. I think partisan cable news has a way bigger impact, and sometimes social media can amplify that. But again, right, the social media effects, if they are there, are not like the direct cause. They're more indirect, and they're filtered through these other sorts of things.
And so when you're talking partisan cable news, we're talking
Fox News mostly, and a way lesser extent MSNBC, because it just doesn't even have the viewers. Fox is the big effect, and there's a ton of data and stuff showing how Fox sets the agenda for Republicans, conservatives, et cetera. It brings in kind of more extreme voices into it. They've even done showing that having Fox lower on the channel dial actually, as a sort of weird quasi thing, actually increased Republican vote shares in places where that happened. So it's a big effect. It's a big effect. And it's bigger than anything that goes on Facebook, et cetera. Partially because it also takes those things that are in the dark corners of Facebook and then blasts it.
Just a little bit on kind of the evolution of this, because I teach courses in the 60s and kind of show campaign ads and Reagan, if there's going to be a bloodbath, let it begin here.
Yeah.
Then the killings at Kent State, where Nixon and Agnew and incite things. But even then, that seemed, or Rhodes, the governor of Ohio, Kent State, that seemed almost not necessarily peripheral, but it wasn't dominant. What do you think that began to shift to the point where Trump can make this kind of incitement basically part of his stump speech?
Yeah, it's tough. There's some arguments that the Tea Party seeded the grounds for a lot of, because the Tea Party is now so folded into mainstream Republican. Yeah. People don't even talk about it anymore. Right? It's just, it's just Republican. But that was, an insurrectionist movement within, we wanted to take over and get rid of the rhinos and other things. And I think like the fact is that parties are not, stable things, right? They're coalitions that jockey and other things. And I know people on the left will like poo-poo some folks who say, oh, I long for the days of other Republicans or other things. But I do think there is a truth to say that this is a different Republican Party, and to say that this has always been the case is wrong. I do think, though, right, Trump definitely accelerated. In my data, you can see threats and nasty language, which again is, to me, I'm not somebody who's like the language police, and I'm not going to say we need to kumbaya and just be hosts. He's a good sir, but I disagree with him. But it's what it comes with all that. It's like both a barometer of what's going on, but also an accelerant in some ways. So I definitely think Trump happened. And then I think the surprising thing is that January 6th I think a lot of people were like, okay, this is the ignominy, this is the shame, this is he'll go down. And that didn't happen. And I think along the way, we've seen, in some sense, the weakness of the Republican Party elites and also the strength of the MAGA movement.
Do you think things like January 6th and actually the recent assassination attempt on Trump have affected views on political violence?
Yeah, it's tricky because I think that January 6th, I think that the weird thing is if you were to travel in like a time machine and tell Republicans in 2004, 2005, that mainstream Republican talking points would be that there's an attack on the Capitol and that the FBI is behind it, they would have said, get at it. What? No, that's crazy talk. Go back to the Marvel universe, right? That's weird. So I think January 6th has definitely shifted views, not so much on violence, but what I would say is in some senses even more concerning is what Republicans want to do with the federal government if and when they take power. And this is a close election. I think the ideas that they want to politicize law enforcement even worse than Nixon in many ways, that they're looking to Orban in Hungary for ideas and other things. That's the other thing too, that's, I would say, part of the weird moment is that US conservatism was different than European conservatism, right? There was the John Birch background and the libertarian impulses. And that I would say there's still some of that, but a lot of the hints and the evolution and other things have been from like the far right in Europe. That's like I think a different sort of beast that we're talking about. But I think in general, and again, I haven't seen, and there's some like polling evidence that didn't shift acceptability of violence against the masses. But maybe my plea is I'm not an elitist in the sense that I like nice brands, but I'm elitist in that I think that it's the Republican Party activists, candidates, donors, and politicians who matter way more than the average Republicans in this. And there, I think you can argue that it has, both through changing views and attitudes, but also look who's left the Republican Party and look who's replaced them. This is, again, it's a different party. It's a different movement.
Yeah, Lynn Cheney's been kicked out, which is still insane. The demonic family of the GOP, and they're Tucson now. It's crazy.
She endorsed Kamala. That's
Yeah.
again, that suggests something.
Yeah. Actually, to go back a minute, because you were talking about political violence, what about the militia movements in the 90s, which is within my memory, the first time we saw that on a big scale. And at the time, Republicans weren't embracing it, but you could clearly see there was a distinction there. And I guess let me just work in on for a minute here, because you just mentioned on January 6th, I think many of us thought, okay, this should be disqualifying forever, right? They have no credibility.
It was in Brazil, like when they had a much
right. In Brazil, they arrested Bolsonaro within 3 months. Here, Merrick Garland is useless. But how much of that kind of goes back, and how much of that is just due to the indifference of, I would actually, like the media, I think they talk about it, but they always, I think, often an equivalency there. One of my pet peeves is the left itself, which I think lets this stuff go. They don't really challenge it vigorously or aggressively, and they just almost accept it and keep moving further to the right. Without that opposition there, without that kind of counterbalance, you see it spreading. This is a long question, comment. The other thing that I was going to specifically ask about is now, especially in the last several years, we're seeing these threats against librarians, board members, elections officials. Now, I've studied protest movements in the U.S. pretty extensively, and most of the time violence was directed at SDS on the campus or the Army Math Research Center or whatever. Now, it seems to become far more diffuse, and just regular people are in the crosshairs now. Is that kind of you think that's what's happening, or?
Yeah, so that was the question comment, which I appreciate, because I can address both. Is I think that might be, and if you were to look at one of the effects maybe of social media, it would be in this diffuse nature of we're going to dox the local election counter, right? Who's for a long time has been an anonymous official or a volunteer, which is pretty low key job, right? And I do think that part where we're going to go to school board meetings and we're going to start doing really weird stuff at school board meetings and the Moms for Liberty, other sorts of doxing things. I mean, again, that is part of MAGA in the sense that is definitely I would say a legacy of Trump. And there were elements of this before. You're aware, there's the professor watch list and other things, but it's not, I would say it's more part and parcel of politics when you see candidates and other people retweeting or sharing these kinds of things. Yeah. The idea about the militia movement, I think, is an interesting thing, like you were talking about in the 90s, and having gone back and teaching a little bit on this, is that it was a big deal and it's swept under people have forgotten, the Michigan militia had a lot of people within it, and it was pretty diffuse. Oklahoma City is definitely where I think that receded, and the federal government cracked down on it in a pretty big way. And in some sense, the profile of a lot of the militia folks, former military white guys, generally speaking, that's a pretty easy group for the federal government if it wants to infiltrate and crack down on. So I would say the suggestion here is that I think, and what's happened, and we see that all the way back to the DHS report that got super politicized about the growing threat of right-wing extremism, is there is a recognition now, I think for sure among law enforcement, if that you start going after some of these organizations, even what's happened on January 6th and other things, you're going to run into an even stronger buzzsaw of politics, that these are not the militia movement's relationship with the Republican Party was much looser than it is now with some of the Proud Boys and other things, and CPAC and all these groups showing up together, going down to Mar-a-Lago. Told me Nick Fuentes, open white nationalist, would be down there. Say that's crazy town. But I think finally the point about the left is I do think there's a lot of debates that are happening internally about what is the appropriate way to confront the threat of MAGAism and other things. But I also think one thing that cannot be true is that Democrats and the left have to win essentially every election of consequence in perpetuity, right? If we have that, and that's what the sort of thing is, that's not a democracy, right? Democracies are where parties lose elections. And if you think that we lose here, we're done, Supreme Court will get even more tilted. They're going to come after all these other things. That's a really concerning place. And that's, I think, at least my poli-sci side gets really nervous about that as like a trajectory. There's a 50-50 chance Kamala Harris loses. And then what does that look like in the US for freedom of expression, political parties, all that? We're seeing in Florida, right? DeSantis striking out district attorneys he doesn't like. They're trying to challenge all these signatures down there on the ballot. The states are both laboratories of democracy and autocracy, I think, in some ways.
Yeah. Talking about this trajectory as we go into 2024, because there's actually a lot of buzz about a potential civil war if Trump loses. And then I was actually just watching an interview with Stacey Abrams where they're going to challenge, no matter what happens in Georgia, they're going to fight and challenge if the Democrats win, that sort of thing. This may be asking you to look too much into a crystal ball, but do you foresee like more January 6th or things that are worse or will it be less? Or
I think when the rhetoric is that this is the election, could be the last election, right? This is the one that matters. And this, especially on the MAGA side, is definitely part of this, right? They're going to try to steal it. So I would say you have that sort of as a baseline catalyst, like folks are activated. Law enforcement, I think they are better or aware of some of these things. But I definitely, what about some random polling place or other things? I don't know. We have a lot of guns in this country. And that's where I think about when people trying to argue like incitement around the Trump assassination attempt. We've had a lot of pivotal elections, right? A lot of countries have pivotal elections, but a lot of countries don't have 42% of the world's weapons and have military grade hardware available for everyone. But I would say I'm very concerned about violence, but I would say I'm more concerned about policy in the sense of Project 2025. And again, those things, I think the media, like when mainstream sort of newspapers, the New York Times, Washington Post, and other things are very focused on like instability and like violent events. And there's good reason for that. But most of the things where we've seen, and this is the Ziblatt, Levitsky, democracy, how democracies die, but it's true, is it's not going to happen. Like think of Roe v. Wade. It wasn't somebody who firebombed it. It was, they engineered, they embargoed, they did all these things, and they have a 6-3 Supreme Court that's super conservative and super activist. And that has a way bigger impact on our lives. And if you read through Project 2025, that scares me more than the terribleness and of the threat of election violence, but that's a bigger deal, I think, in people's lives. So that's my, take on that.
Last spring, 2024, we saw campuses erupt, and the crackdown was pretty harsh. And many times in blue cities with Democratic governors, Democratic mayors, Democratic president, vice president. And I saw yesterday that students are back now for fall semester, and the campus strategy is to basically crack down sooner and harsher. So that's what they learned from it. So it's a violent response to what I would call basically totally nonviolent movement. And again, this is being done in blue cities, and it has fairly wide support. So how does that kind of play into this? Because I think going back to the 60s where you had the hard hat riots and people attacking students. And when it's happening at an Ivy League school, it's hard to get as, I think, worked up over elitist students, right? But the reality is this is happening all over 155 campuses. So how does this kind of more harsh and I would argue violent response fit into this? Is this making things worse because it's being accepted now by both sides?
Yeah, I think campus free speech has always been like, I think an ideal that was rarely ever lived up to. And when the brass tacks came, then you see it happen. I think for a lot of, I'll put on, if I were a senior administrators, like a dean or other things, it's like that's a tough a very tough job that I wouldn't want, because essentially they've been caught in the sense of, I think, campus politics are also being used, as we saw the hearings on anti-Semitism, when people have pushed great replacement theories, which is a virulent anti-Semitic theory, and then are complaining about anti-Semitism on campus, the game is over. And I also think in some ways that universities have gotten out over their skis on some of the ideas that they need to have a policy on every event, right? They basically will comment on some and not on others. And I think I think universities are not embassies or other things that should have foreign policy positions. That's my personal sort of view. But I think that what's happened is people on the right very much saw, oh, this is an issue that divides the left on some ways. We also know that we've made colleges and education polarization like a big part of the election, Ivy League elites. Let's watch them be in a position where either they're supporting terrorists or they're beating up their own students. And some of the places where maybe people didn't have as much compunction were open to cracking down on peaceful protests. So I think it was an issue that folks on the right were like, yes, this is a win for us on either way. And, oh, by the way, also, this is part of the broader crackdown on higher education, like DeSantis in Florida and other places, where we're going to this is another reason for us to pack the board of trustees with political folks who don't really care about education writ large.
What's interesting, one of the things I find interesting, I also will say that it broke up a little bit when Bob was asking a question, so I may be repeating some of what he said. There's this frame that what's happening on campus is our students or outside agitators are being violent towards Jewish students on campus and things like that. But the only real violence we're seeing is the police acting violently against students and occupiers and things like that. And I'm wondering, to me, that's actually is actually pretty normal within like left protest movements and things like that. And I'm wondering how you see this sort of, how this is playing out, how left protest and nonviolent action is like being framed as political violence by the right or by the mainstream or by the media. That was a long, convoluted question. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, I think there are like a bunch of things. Like one is just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more generally is both, there are large Jewish Israeli diasporas in the US and also a large Palestinian diaspora. So people pay attention to it. This has been like this has been an incredibly violent period even for that conflict that's been going on for a long time. So it's not surprising that there is a ton of attention going on. The US is a supporter and providing weapons to Israel. That's full stop. So it's not surprising that we see protests on campus. I do think what's, again, interesting to me as somebody from like but this may be more, again, Bob's wheelhouse, is that it's weird, and I'm not privy to the email conversations between trustees and former alumni during the 60s and 70s, but it feels partially that because this is an election season and because of the broader attempts by the conservative movement to crack down on media, there has been so much more hyper focus on these protests. They've been big protests, but there've been more hyper focus on this and trying to find ways to say, see, I knew they were doing this, right? Have there been anti-Semitic incidents? Yes. Like, I think for sure there have been, and people have used that speech, but the people who, I think anti-Semitism is a problem and other things, but I think the people who are using anti-Semitism are not using it in necessarily like a way where they actually care about anti-Semitism. They're using it as a way, hi, we're going to politicize this. This is another reason, again, for us to crack down on speech we don't like. And I think it's, if I were a Republican or conservative strategist, I totally understand why they're doing this, right? Because this is something that's, oh, this is great. We get to show mayhem on college campuses. It's our favorite thing. It's disorder, and it's a bunch of college elitists saying ridiculous things, and we can focus on all these sorts of things that our base loves.
Plus, it's a way to split an important piece of Biden's coalition away from him.
Yeah. In the 60s and 70s, which you just mentioned, there seemed to be more of a conflict, like talking about campuses again, within the university. There were some university presidents who were like anguished and, waited deliberating over whether they should call authorities in it. Boards of trustees and alumni, I think there was actually a tension there. But now you've got people like Ackman and Kraft who are just like throwing gasoline on the fire. They're going to campus at a place like Berkeley, Columbia, or Penn, or wherever, attacking these presidents the presidents who are attacking the protesters are then being attacked as like coddling the protesters and being anti-Semitic. So it's this bizarro circumstance. And again, I just, again, in all these ways, it seems like it's really accelerated. And it's become more kind of bipartisan, really. University administrators are considered part of the liberal elite. And you have people like Adams and Hochul in New York, or Gavin Newsom in California. And their solution, which they go through now pretty quickly, is a violent, suppression of these people. And again, I didn't see that as much. I'm not naive about the role of the state by any means, but it just seems like it's much easier to go to that now. Is that when you perceive that it's become more legitimate, become more credible? It's now in your toolbox of accepted responses more than it ever was before.
Yeah, I think one thing that's, again, is tricky is that I think, again, is free speech and protest, right? I think to a lot of people means holding up signs that are pretty anodyne and singing, we'd like different policies. And in practice, I think we all know here from different ways, that whether it be from actually attending these, studying these, et cetera, that it's much more contentious, right? It's called contentious politics for a reason. And so I think when people get contentious, and I think this is more generally the sort of views of a lot of administrators, as there have been more demands to make the campus safe from guns, safe from maybe people we don't always agree with, right? That this was able to tap into this nascent sort of safety culture. And also more generally, like all of the emails and like position statements that they have, right? It builds this, we can't allow this to happen because students are made to feel uncomfortable, right? I think it's an unwinnable position that university administrators got themselves into in some ways. And I think the more general thing, and I think the point that you make, is that these things that would maybe take a couple days to reach the trickle in from student newspapers, and then oh, wow, did you hear what happened here or there, right? Now it's happening. People are following along. They're live streaming all this. So the incentive to crack down earlier, I think, is stronger. And maybe that's, again, we're coming back to this sort of social media amplification of some of these trends to begin with.
I'm going to switch topics over a little bit, somewhat related to protests on the left, unless Bob has any other follow-ups for this before. Just because we wanted to talk a little bit about violence on the left. Where, in what ways have you seen, this is like a two-part question here. Where have you seen political violence manifest on the left? You've also been doing a study on radical environmentalism, which includes property destruction related tactics like sabotage and arson and things like that. I'm just wondering how this differs from what we've seen with the political right in recent years.
Yeah. So that's a good question, right? Is the easiest sort of view, and it's like an empirical truth, but also like, but it is that these things come in waves, right? Is right in the 20s and 30s, we're talking about anarchists, 60s and 70s, we're talking about national liberation movement. And then we get into the 70s and 80s. If you were talking about terrorism, are you talking about narco-terrorism, Salafi jihadism, right? And then we've entered the right-wing era of terrorism, right? So there's a wave, and right. So the view would be, oh, it's coming, right, on the left at some point. I think that's maybe empirically true, but that's also not very helpful because it doesn't tell us when, why, and where. One thing that I think is true, and it like dovetails back to what we've been talking about, the sort of more general MAGA movement, is that this kind of relationship with violence and elites who are okay with using intimidation and other things is much stronger, probably on the right now. And partially that's because of gun culture and other things. When you have politicians who pose with AR-15s on their Christmas cards, give them away at political rallies, right? It says something about violence within your movement, or the acceptability of taking violence as a means to stop the bad thing that you don't like. I think on the left, and you guys have had a bunch of people on your show who've debated about some of these different tactics. There's still I think there's definitely a big objection, like a hard, bright line to hurting humans in the left, I think, more generally speaking, right? Now, property destruction is where you get different debates about activists who will say, I'm not going to say it was a bad thing, but I don't think it's smart strategically. And so I think that's kind of part of the answer. The other thing too is that one of my favorite books, Kathleen Belew, like bringing the war home, about American soldiers coming back in these sort of waves of right-wing activism, right? So there is this relationship that after these big wars, the war on terror, the Gulf War, Vietnam War, right? You have these guys who come back who have some form of political alienation from society and other things. And they have this sort of this milieu or this sort of network in which they get involved in right-wing militias and other sorts of groups that then some of them go on to commit violence. There's not that really on the left. Scott and I are maybe more familiar, and Bob too, and maybe is the left had the hardcore punk scene and the anarchist scene. But again, there was a big taboo against harming individuals. So I don't know, if you look back on the 20s and 30s, like the labor movement and the socialist and communist parties, they had this infrastructure for building people and bringing them in. And I don't know if that, where that is on the left, right? I don't think, I'll go out on a limb. I don't think it's like the youth climate movement is probably not where you're going to get those folks coming in. But I think that's a big part of it, because I think the question that a lot of activists I've talked to, and I know Scott have talked to, is like, it's really bad. The threat of climate change is horrific in a lot of ways. We lived through wildfire smoke, the hottest years on record. Where is the action to match it? And I think you have to have this kind of network or sort of scene, right, that brings people in to have some kind of movement that may be willing to do those sorts of things. And I don't really see it right now, maybe on the left. Also, a lot of them have faced repression pretty early on, right? So that's another thing that gets caught in the net.
We actually have seen some violence like that on the right related to climate change, actually.
Yeah.
What I was going to say, go ahead. I'm sorry. I need to write notes down. I'm getting old.
My other kind of question related to this is that during the 60s and 70s, we did see property destruction from like the weathermen and things like that. And we've done shows on this and you've done studies on this, but there's this sort of late 90s, early 2000s sort of green scare era where, people have engaged with property destruction. But I think you're right that I can tell you, I've been in a lot of radical environmental spaces and I've been in a lot of punk spaces, and there's a whole like mantra around no violence towards any living thing, trees, animals, people, and things like that. But I also do note, at least within social media and some in more in-person spaces, is that there is like this sort of increasing rhetoric around, I'm going to punch a Nazi. Richard Spencer getting punched on January 20th. 2017 that was a rallying cry for a lot of people in the anti-fascist left.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. And I also think, I hate to say we're stacking everything up towards 2024, but if the people in the left start to see, hey, there's not a real point to participating in politics because it's blocked or other things, then I think maybe you start seeing other forms of actions and other sort of challenges to the state. And that's what we observe more generally. Yeah. Bob,
that's what I was, that kind of reminded me. But it's not a bad thing. I'm not advocating violence because they have nukes and armor, drones and all that stuff. But at the same time, and this isn't really an opinion question, I said, because we often have this debate, right? Probably you've been in it. Should the left be more, whatever word, aggressive, assertive, military, whatever? But I studied this not nearly to the extent you have, but it does seem that when there's a more assertive left with, even if they're bluster, even if they're bluffing, but that is able to say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to go out. It seems like you get better outcomes when there is like an active, assertive, aggressive, or even militant opposition than what I see now, which is just essentially silence on it, right? On election day 2020, there were groups all over the country opposed to Trump, ready to go out because they knew that there would be some shenanigans. But it was clear that night that Biden won. So they called off every protest and gave the far right 12 weeks before January 6th to do whatever it wanted, to set the media narrative. Do you think you get better outcomes if there is a more kind of aggressive or militant response from, let's just call it the left, whatever, the street left? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest questions in social movements is, do radical flanks work? And we know the answer is yes, sometimes, right? And when do they work and when do they not? I think the question that you asked also made me think of two other questions that I've had with other activists. Is one is the right also has, especially on the assertive end, right? They have MMA, right? They have the UFC and all these sort of Joe Rogan influencers where
Hulk Hogan.
Yeah, we're not. I was not ready for Hulk.
We got Jesse Ventura.
But there isn't, and so in some of these spaces that are more aggressive in other things, and I think the question is right for, does the left need to have something to say to folks who maybe are disenchanted, but not, I think some of the things too is when you talk to some of these people in some of these spaces, their politics are not as like calcified and that they're upset. And then they're looking for a narrative. And if the only narrative that they see in the UFC space is it's woke, liberal, university elites are there, right? Does the left need an alternative to bring some of those folks in? I would say yes, right? That helps them not become a party like of elites and just people who I think it represents America, and it also has all these other knock-on effects. The second point that you made about outcomes also made me think, and it's to our debate about property destruction, is the LA riots were horrible on so many levels and caused a ton of damage and other things. And overall, it was a really bad thing. But one of the things that also came out of it, and there's some political science work on this too, is that the response of the city was like, oh, we actually do have a really big problem with policing and in some of these neighborhoods, and not saying LAPD is by any stretch of the imagination fixed, but it's better than it was. Right. And I think so the riots had, complicated causes and other things, but there are some evidence that it's not always, sometimes contentious events also can have outcomes that are good at the end.
I'm thinking like 2020, because capitalists, they want to make money on that, but capitalists want stability. And what, like my take on the summer of 2020 was that you had 25 million people in the streets and they were pretty relentless. And so within a couple months, you had corporations putting out Black Lives Matter flags and rainbow flags, and the military, Mark Milley and a lot of military officials resisted Trump when he wanted to say. So the message I took from that was that like this, and if you look at polling at the time, what was it? 54% supported burning that precinct building in Minneapolis, right?
Yeah.
And just the other day, I saw a poll from September 2020. So the protests were like, 3-4 months in, where it showed like, I forget, 60 or so percent still supported Black Lives Matter after all the so-called violence that summer. It just seems like there's actually data out there to suggest that resisting people as aggressively as you can without being stupid about it, strategically or tactically, isn't a bad idea. And the Democrats obviously want to tamper that down, even though in 2020 it probably helped them. How do you have these discussions on the left about not what our opinions are, because I try not to do that because nobody gives a shit what I think, but what's happened in the past and how you do have groups, and we can block that with groups like SDS or the Weather Underground or Earth First, which actually I think I would agree with you, made substantial gains.
Yeah. So one, I'll try and answer that in two parts. So I think
we're professors, so we can't just.
I can't do it straight. But I'll give you the first was an anecdote that came up when I was interviewing a police officer who was in the Pacific Northwest, who was in part of Operation Backfire that went after the Earth Liberation Front. And one of the things that he said, which I was not ready for, was I will never condone incendiary devices and bombing. And I was like, okay, here we go. This is what you expect. They deserve to be put in jail. He said, but the people who engaged at Warner Creek and the other tree blockades, he goes, they were right. They're the reason we have old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest. And if you had said, hey, a police officer forward who was involved in Operation Backfire said that, I think you would be like, no way, that's never going to come out of his mouth. So that's one thing. I think the second thing, and I do think, again, this comes to our point about social media, is how do groups, in this case on the left, build power to get people out in the streets, but also sustain change? Because getting people out in the streets, I think we find you can do that. In 2020 was this social stress experiment. We're going to have crazy election stuff. We're going to have a pandemic. We're going to have record unemployment. It was like Durkheim was like, I told you this is what happens, right? Autonomy run wild. But the question is, how do you then transfer that into actual gains? And I don't know. I'm not here to judge one way or the other about the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it's been successful or not. In some places it has, but I think given the scale of the protests, you could maybe say, why weren't the impacts lasting? Why was it just, we're going to temporarily maybe reduce some of police budgets or elect some progressive district attorneys for a few election cycles who then get washed out, right? Recalled, right? Yeah. So the question is, maybe were the goals wrong? Was there not sustained movement? And I think some of the people would say is that, well, social media, you can get people out in the streets, but do you have that kind of longer term horizon networks to sustain it? And I don't know if that's the case. And that's a question for Scott more than it is for me.
I think, if I were to continue along that. So at one point in 2020, you did see corporations and Wall Street and the military, I think as much as anybody, stop Trump, resist Trump, right? Mm-hmm. But the aftermath of that, immediately with, Biden and Pelosi and Schumer and Bernie Sanders and the squad all said, oh, we're never going to cut police budgets. Defunding, that's a ridiculous. So you had this reckoning in the United States with a lot of people saying, hey, the situation has gotten so bad, we need to go on the streets too. And we need to meet, not necessarily fire with fire, but be more aggressive. And it seemed like but at the same time, a lot of these people put their faith in this Democratic Party, this process, which is very little different. Biden's increased police budgets by $300 billion or something like that. Democrats were responsible for much of the repression on campuses this spring. So it seems like that's another part of what is the role of people in the streets and their relationship to the political process. Do they have to be totally dissociated from it, which is what I think they do. But
yeah, the security issues, I can just say, I haven't done a lot of policing work in the US. I've done it more outside the US, like in Mexico or in Georgia. And I do think one of the things that I was a little surprised at was that there were people that were calling for it, but is the US, not all, but a lot of it is really bad at catching criminals in the sense of our clearance rate for homicides is terrible, right? And I think the view, and we go to an extreme case like where I was doing research in Western Mexico in around Morelia, is in these places where, our clearance rate is 40 to 50% for a homicide rate. There it's 5%. And that's where you started to see vigilante squads come in. And I think that a lot of issues, around policing are one, both it's, it's way too intense, it's too brutal, but it also doesn't, do the clearance, right? It doesn't solve the crimes. Because I think the people who are in these communities are both over-policed and under-policed in some ways, right? They do not get the clearance rate on violent crime that they want, right? And then there's also the kind of the racial profiling, sort of police presence, et cetera. And so I think that's the hard thing. And again, I leave this to activists to figure out, but just from outside the US is right. There are two things people don't like. People don't like it when they get repressed and thrown in jail for no reason. They also don't like it when there are a lot of homicides that go unsolved. And those are both policing problems, but they're different kinds. And that's the thing that I would say is actually maybe focusing and trying to get the solve rate up would be that's a winning issue in some ways, but that's neither here nor there.
So I have one more topic of questions. I don't know if Bob has anything else.
I have 5 million, but I don't about this right now. This is a discussion Scott and I have had for years, and on the left, we've been talking about this for 30 years, 40 years. I don't know. So
20, I think we're at 25 now, Bob.
You're a lot younger than me, but this has been fantastic, and I really appreciate it. Yeah, we should continue it at some point. This is really great.
Yeah. So my actually final question is, as we like to talk about popular culture too, and moods, trends, events, we see emerge in popular culture. And so I'm wondering around back to the issue of political violence, where if we've seen this sort of uptick in rhetoric around political violence play out in more fiction, books, television, movies, and that sort of thing.
Oof. It's tricky. So there was, I think of the Civil War film that came out, I think it was last April. It came out. I saw that with my wife, and I don't know. There's definitely more. There was definitely for instance, after 9/11, there was Homeland and all these shows that capitalized on the kind of war on terror and sold it in different ways, Zero Dark 30, et cetera. I don't know if there has been an uptick in political violence, but I think it depicted. But I think the Civil War film, I think it did fairly well at the box office. I'd have to check again. And some people really liked it, and some people didn't. I was on the mixed in that I thought some of the, a couple things you got to tell me the politics. As a political scientist, if there's just a Civil War film and just saying there's a Civil War and you don't tell me what are people arguing over, that's a problem. But I think, maybe not even on political violence, but I think the popular culture over the last 15 years, I think probably that gave us rise of Trump was, and it's way more important, is reality television, right? That's the one where, You're Fired and The Apprentice and all these other sorts of very crass but enjoyable sort of social media style shows with engagement and other things. I think that has maybe a bigger impact, but that's for another time, is that I think the politics of reality shows, because
we should do a show. We should do a show on the politics of reality TV.
I think, yeah, because they're all, the other thing too, is that if you watch the reality shows, especially, not to out myself, my wife likes to watch, and I watch as well. And it's
Blame it on her.
no, never. No, I'm
teasing. I'm
in
teasing.
I'm in it hook, line, and sinker. But basically what happens is every season somebody is like charged with mortgage fraud, elder fraud, right? And these are the kinds of the storylines that drive things, and it's part of the pop culture. And I think so people are like, oh, they're famous, and maybe they did some shady political things, but like that would have been totally disqualifying. We could have a laundry list of things that would have been disqualifying like 20, 30 years ago from politics that aren't. Right.
But even in the 70s, I remember Dirty Harry. It was like people like really gravitated toward that kind of stuff. What's the Charles Bronson stuff? So
Yeah, exactly.
Well, in a couple of weeks, we're really excited. We're going to talk to Richard, and his basic argument is that the prototypical American forever is like the guy with a gun. So
100%.
And it really is baked into our kind of national DNA. So.
Yeah. No, I think that's, you could make the argument like the Jack Reacher, the Bourne, some of those things, but also like through the war on terror, right? Like the special forces and these kinds of hyper masculine movies. But the gun is the thing. Like when you talk to people outside the US and you like, especially another school shooting in Georgia, right? What US culture around the two things that make the US stand out is one, its long history of racism and guns. Those are like the two things that really just are America in a lot of ways. And
the day of the Parkland massacre in 2018, I was teaching at Venice, and those kids just like, they were stunned. They kept saying, what happened? How could that happen? Mm-hmm. They just like, and I don't really have a good explanation for it. Like the whole class, we didn't talk about anything but that. They were just like, these Italian kids who were 18, 19 years old. How the hell could that happen?
And nothing changes. That's like
nothing. Well, I was going to ask you that earlier because as soon as even yesterday, right? Immediately people come out, their first response, it isn't even thoughts and prayers anymore. It's guns have nothing to do with this, right? The first response after a school massacre, sometimes incited by right-wing, I keep going back to the El Paso massacre, was at a Walmart or something, where Trump, the guy who did it, his manifesto essentially quoted Trump's stuff about immigrants, right? And the first response is always, we can't do anything about guns after 20 school kids have been massacred.
It's because we accept, I think this goes back to the point about when you're talking about on the left, where is the impetus, right? I do think the Supreme Court, and if the trajectory of the Supreme Court, Trump wins, the Supreme Court could be 7-2, and thinking about some of those decisions, I think that guns are a symptom of it, but more generally is like in any other sort of democracy that's consolidated, if you were to have kids gunned down in elementary schools repeatedly, and there's no action on guns, that's the definition of insanity to me. Like kids being killed and just saying, well, I guess we just have a lot more crazy people than other countries, which we know is not true, right? That's just not true.
I'm going to wrap it up on that note. Thomas, has been great talking with you today. Folks, we've been talking with Thomas Zeitzoff, professor at American University, author of Nasty Politics, and has a forthcoming book on radical environmentalists. If you like what you're watching, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Give us a subscribe on YouTube. Give us a rate and review if you're listening to us on an audio platform. And then if you want to make a donation, go to greenredpodcast.com and .org, and hit that support and make a donation, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And Thomas, we'll talk to you again soon. Love to have you back to talk about your new book and maybe more on this topic as we get into this election season.
Definitely. Thank you guys so much.
Right. Everybody else, take care and misbehave.